The Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Let me welcome our special representative and former colleague, Tom Perriello. It's nice to have you here. Thank you for your willingness to take on this incredibly challenging role in regards to Sudan. We recognize that the circumstances are dire, and we appreciate your willingness to serve in this capacity, and we look forward to your comments today and our ability to engage in a conversation with you. In recent weeks, the satellite images show evidence of brutal fighting outside Al-Fashir. It is the only remaining city in Sudan's Darfur region the RSF, the Parliamentary Rapid Support Forces, have not taken over. Eyewitnesses report attacks on over 16 nearby towns with entire villages burned to the ground. Starving civilians are trying to escape the violence with their belongings on foot. As the death toll climbs, the United Nations has warned that the lives of 800,000 civilians who are still living in the city are in danger. It has been more than a year since the current conflict erupted in Sudan between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces. In the last year, the two sides have killed detainees and indiscriminately bombed civilians. Both sides have. They have used rape as a weapon of war, targeting women of certain ethnic groups. They have conscripted children as soldiers. They have destroyed farmland, looted supplies, and attacked humanitarian workers. Earlier this year, videos emerged of troops chanting ethnic slurs as they paraded the streets, holding decapitated heads. 15,000 to 30,000 people have already died. 8 million people have fled their homes. 25 million people, including 14 million children, are in desperate need of food and water and medicine. At the recent humanitarian conference in Paris, the United States announced over $100 million in additional aid to respond to the conflict. Donors committed more than $2 billion, but that is barely half of what the United Nations says it needs in Sudan. And it's not clear whether those promised funds will be turned over anytime soon. Meanwhile, the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights released a report last month concluding that the RSF is committing genocide in Sudan. Today, with the RSF threatening the city of Al-Fashir, we are on the brink of a mass atrocity against non-Arab ethnic groups. Analysts say the RSF could unleash another wave of violence like their assault on West Darfur last year, echoing the atrocities carried out 2 decades ago by the Janjaweed. Yet the international community has no plan to protect civilians should the RSF mount a full-scale assault. Given the dire circumstances, we welcome the appointment of the special representative. I strongly urge the Biden administration to fully staff your office with the personnel you request as quickly as possible. Ceasefire after ceasefire has been violated. The risk of further atrocities is high. Diplomatic efforts to end the conflict have failed. I think we need to make it clear to both parties and their foreign backers the cost of a continued conflict is higher than the cost of coming to the negotiating table. A report from last year by the United Nations panel on experts found evidence that the UAE was giving arms to RSF. I'm also deeply concerned by reports that Iran has re-entered the Sudan while possibly providing drones to the Sudanese armed forces. We've seen what Iran's support for terrorism looks like across the region. These drones can carry significant payloads, and they use them for catastrophic consequences to civilian populations. Russia, Egypt, Chad, and Libya have also been implicated in the conflict. None of the external actors are being constructive. In some cases, quite the opposite. As the United Nations Secretary General told the Security Council this April, external actors continue to flout the sanctions regime imposed by the Council to support a political settlement, thereby fueling the conflict. This is illegal, it is immoral, and it must stop. I could not agree more. We will need to see real progress unless we make it clear no nation will be providing arms or support to these groups. We will not see progress until we get the external factors and support removed. There has been a blatant violation of the UN arms embargo that has been in place for decades. Special Envoy Perriello, you have a Herculean task before you, and I look forward to hearing your plans. For example, how will you push for resumption of peace talks that will end hostilities for Darfur to the east? How do you plan to galvanize additional humanitarian support for the aid workers trying to mitigate the impending famine? How will you support the malign actions of external actors? How will you promote accountability for human rights abuses? How will you elevate civilian voices as part of the negotiations with the future Sudanese government? Never again must mean never again. The Sudanese people deserve security and prosperity as much as any other people of the world. With that, I'll turn to the ranking member, Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman and I are in full agreement that you have a Herculean task in front of you, and we need some answers. We really do. Every time we hold a hearing on Sudan, we talk about how the situation has worsened. Despite these public discussions and routine briefings from state, the administration hasn't actually made any tangible progress in improving or solving the problem. Congress continues to show leadership on Sudan, but the administration isn't doing its part. For over 2 years, I've urged the administration to clearly stated Sudan policy. After 27 months of waiting, during which another coup and a civil war was ignited in Sudan, I'm appalled by the administration's continued failure to present a clear, comprehensive plan of action to this committee. Admittedly, that being a difficult task, but it needs to be done. Special Envoy Perriello, it's incumbent upon you to break this cycle of indecision and give us a comprehensive plan. Please, the American people, the Sudanese people, our allies, and this committee need to know how the U.S. will help end the war, thereby also bringing an end to the suffering of millions and holding those responsible to account. This committee also needs to hear how the department is preparing for and mitigating the worst-case scenario. The potential for more significant famine, genocidal acts, state collapse, and fragmentation of fighting backed by more regional proxies are real possibilities. This scenario not only has grave implications for the region, but also for the national security of the United States and our allies. As soon as the conflict began in April, in Sudan, began in April 2023, I repeatedly called for a special envoy. I wrote letters to the president, put out multiple public statements, even led a joint Senate and House resolution, all of which I'd like to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Despite these efforts, it took 10 months for the administration to appoint you. Then you were only given a temporary appointment for 6 months to sidestep the law on special envoys. You have limited resources and a patchwork of support staff assisting you across multiple State Department bureaus. This is not what we called for. Your mission is difficult, no doubt. The administration's response to the crisis in Sudan has been weak. Compared to its efforts in regional crises like Gaza and Ukraine, the administration has shown no leadership and little engagement in Sudan. The emergency diplomacy with Saudi Arabia and Jeddah has repeatedly failed, but you're recommending another round of talks. Well, talks can be important. This committee needs to know why these talks will be different and how you will actually achieve something. I'd also like to understand how your engagement and travels to Europe and the Gulf have yielded a change in approach by our partners to rein in and disrupt the actions of outside actors like the UAE, Iran, and Russia. These actors have descended upon Sudan like vultures, picking away at the last vestiges of the state, extracting the country's precious resources and fueling this war for their own ends. Please don't spend your time today telling us about how bad the situation is. We already know that, and the world knows that. In this limited time today, we need to hear the administration's specific, very specific, actionable plan on how to get out of this crisis and details on how the U.S. will stop the ongoing genocide in Darfur. Can you promise we'll see bold and resolute action from the U.S.? Will you support my resolution that declares the atrocities in Darfur and other parts of Sudan as genocide? Do you support global Magnitsky sanctions on General Hamedi and the RSF for the death and destruction they've caused? If not, we'll be back there in 12 months, counting more lives lost to greed, hatred, and incompetence. This committee, I believe, on both sides of the aisle, are anxious to hear an actual way forward. Again, you have a difficult task. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Our witness is the Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello, who was appointed on February 26th of this year. He has a long history of working in Africa and on transitional justice. From 2002 to 2003, he worked for the United Nations mandated special court for Sierra Leone, where he became special advisor to the prosecutor. He also worked as a consultant for the International Center for Transitional Justice for Kosovo in 2003, for Darfur in 2005, and for Afghanistan in 2007. He was elected to Congress in 2008, representing the people of Virginia's 5th Congressional District. In 2014, he was appointed U.S. Special Representative for Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, and subsequently served as the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa. Most recently, he was the Executive Director for the U.S. programs at the Open Society Foundation. Mr. Perriello, as you can tell through our opening statements, there are a lot of questions, a lot of issues we'd like to be able to discuss with you. Your full statement will be made part of our record, and you may proceed as you wish.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Risch, Senators. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this horrific situation, but I also specifically want to thank you for your leadership at the chair and ranking member level, and staff level for being one of the few institutions around the world that has been tireless in putting a spotlight on the crisis in Sudan when too much of the world has been silent. The war and humanitarian crisis is already catastrophic, as has been mentioned, and before laying out some comments on the plan forward and reasons for hope, I do want to be absolutely clear that the default trajectory is towards famine, an increasingly factionalized state that brings in regional actors and presents an enormous and unconscionable humanitarian cost, as well as, at this point, a threat to national security because of regional destabilization, as was mentioned. For the past year, the people of Sudan have suffered slaughter, crimes against humanity, sexual violence, ethnic cleansing at the hands of the Rapid Response Forces. The Sudan Armed Forces have bombed civilians and systematically violated international humanitarian law, blocking aid and harassing frontline workers. More than 8 million Sudanese people have been displaced, and 5 million are on the brink of famine. Yet the world has treated Sudan largely as an invisible crisis, rarely covered in the world press. And the Sudanese that I've met, including women and youth, regularly express their appreciation to this body and its members for the statements that have been made in the efforts to create pressure on both internal and external actors that are fueling this conflict. Also want to express appreciation to Senator Booker for making the trip to the camps recently and witnessing firsthand the level of suffering, both from those inside, crossing, and out. When these women and children, too many with bone-thin arms and 1,000-yard stares, were asked at the border why they had fled, the answer repeatedly was simple: food. Food insecurity and malnutrition have reached alarming rates across Sudan, driven by the conflict, the destruction of harvest and food storages, and the blockage of aid. Nearly 18 million people now face food insecurity. The SAF has taken repeated steps to block, disrupt, and slow the delivery of food and medicine to the Sudanese people, and this is unacceptable. But even in areas where we have aid access, like the refugee camps in Chad, we have been running woefully short of resources. For this reason, I applaud the action of this Congress to pass supplemental humanitarian funding earlier this month, which is having an immediate effect on the ability of USAID and PRM and others to save lives. But while aid is vital, the human suffering in Sudan will not stop until this war is over. The Sudanese people have been clear that ending the war is their top priority, and therefore it is mine as the U.S. Special Envoy. While the fighting is between the RSF and SAF, this is much less a civil war than a war on the Sudanese people and their aspirations to a free and democratic future. The RSF and its leadership are rooted in the Janjaweed militias who committed genocide 20 years ago when I first went to Darfur, and they are again conducting a war of unspeakable brutality, ethnic cleansing, and a reign of terror on the people. No external actor providing support to the RSF can claim ignorance of its past or its ongoing atrocities. In a moment, I'll share the outlines of our plan and some reasons for hope about a peaceful resolution. But first, I want to reinforce the comments from the chair and ranking member that the situation left on its current trajectory is getting worse. The situation's getting more factionalized, more polarized, more likely to bring in more regional actors, and with the rainy seasons coming, more likely to have blockages in humanitarian aid delivery. And in particular, if we see the fall of al-Fashir, we will see a new level of suffering for this war. Our strategy, plain and simple, is to end the war. It's to end the war by supercharging our diplomacy around the whole of government, raising the costs of those fighting and fueling the war, and building an alliance of regional partners with enough leverage to compel the two sides to accept a deal that we do not believe they will reach on their own, that hands the Sudanese people back their future. First, our elevated U.S. engagement has included repeated engagement by Secretary Blinken, tremendous support from the Departments of African and Near Eastern Affairs at the Assistant Secretary Bureau and Post level, and coordination across the interagency. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield has declared publicly that Sudan is one of our top 3 priorities for the year in the UN system and has been helping to stoke greater statements and action and pressure from there. Treasury is playing a crucial role in expanding sanctions, and USAID and PRM are continuing to provide support, not just humanitarian, but to civil society and its engagement and pushing for peace. Second, we're continuing to raise the costs of fighting and fueling the war. We're engaged directly with both fighting factions, including top generals, to deter escalation and atrocities. We've led the world on sanctions, both individual and enabling institutions, and made clear that we are prepared to expand those costs. Third, our strategy is based on the premise that a deal to end this war is an absolute necessity, and reverse engineering from there what level of diplomatic power and alignment is needed to compel that result. Every day, every engagement with our African, Gulf, European, and multilateral partners, as well as with the Sudanese people, is about building the political will sufficient to force these actors to silence the guns. This is reflected by, but not limited to, a commitment to new peace talks in the coming weeks, which will include a broader range of key African and Arab regional leaders, a focus on aligning external political will rather than deferring to the two parties, and designed with a clear objective of ending the war through the talks. We have sent that signal clearly to our partners that this is a new day in terms of the scale and cost of the conflicts and the expectations for this round. Finally, and I know I'm running out of time, our greatest source of hope is the resilience and unity of the Sudanese people and their aspirations not just to end the war, but also to restore the path to a free and democratic future. That is the North Star of our policy, standing with the Sudanese people. Sudan faces 2 very different trajectories, one towards famine and fractured state, another towards peace and a promising future. The 2 generals could end this war tomorrow if they had the courage, but they do not. In the absence of that, we are building an alliance of partners for peace strong enough to compel an end to this war. In closing, let me express my appreciation again to this committee for its untiring support for the Sudanese people and for efforts to end this war now. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to allow Senator Risch to ask questions first. The 2 of us are going to have to excuse ourselves in a few minutes. Senator Murphy will take the gavel, and then I will be returning later. So, Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You conceded here in your testimony that, and congratulated this committee for being the only, if possibly, entity that seems to be really concerned about this and focused on it. Why do you think this is? Why is this being just ignored by the rest of the world?
Senator, it's a great question without a great answer. Certainly, we have trouble getting coverage of Africa for issues related to a false sense of hopelessness in an area that I think has great hope. While certainly the situation in Gaza has gotten a lot of attention in the media, this war had been going on for 6 months before that began, and you still were not seeing coverage, not just in the Western press, but in the African press and the Arab world press. We are certainly doing everything we can to raise the stakes of that. I think it has made it easier for bad actors inside and outside to get away with the atrocities and the support for those atrocities when the world seems not to be watching. Sudanese, of course, are. And they are, with great courage every day, documenting the abuses and expanding efforts to get the attention of the world. And we are certainly trying to ensure that we can amplify those voices wherever we can. But as someone who was in Darfur 20 years ago when the world paid great attention to it, the Bush administration was very engaged. We had celebrities, the media, young people like myself, then not young anymore, that were sneaking across borders to try to document the abuses that were going on. We don't have that same engagement today, and I think that's a tragedy. But I know that you and your staff and others have certainly done everything they can to try to shine more of a light on this, and I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah, and obviously, the problem can't get any help if the world doesn't know about what's going on or is ignoring what's going on. And I think your description is good about how it's changed. like you said, there were celebrities, there were all kinds of people that were involved in this before. And why have they just lost attention on this? Because it is so bad? Because there just aren't obvious answers here? Because things are too tough to do? I mean, it's hard to swallow. It really is with something as bad as this is going on the planet, and yet you very seldom, if ever, read stories about this.
I completely agree, and this is why we encouraged Senator Booker to come to the camps, encourage all of you to do what you can to draw attention. And I think, in some ways the tragedy, if you go back 5 years ago, was the lack of attention on the moment of hope, when the Sudanese people, led by women and youth, had risen up to push Bashir out of power. They had begun a constitutional transition that would give them control over their own future and destiny. Like all countries, including our own, you don't get it right the first time. There's some skips along the way. And I think at that point, if we had all done a better job of telling the story of that success, I think people would be looking now at the need simply to get back to the trajectory the Sudanese people had already laid out. And that's our baseline in the negotiations. We shouldn't be renegotiating what the Sudanese people have already determined out of great courage, which is a democratic future that begins with a civilian transition and starts to build those aspects of governance. We have incredible, inspiring stories today. While we do see the youth coming across starving, we also see youth who have come up with completely amazing cash apps and built local kitchens inside to provide food and medicine in areas that are hard hit. We have stories of inspiration and of courage. And I think it is a dark mark on all of us, and certainly on the media and on other actors, that we have not had the attention that we deserve on this conflict, and I think that's made it harder. But we are starting to see the heat turned up on those who are committing the atrocities and supporting it.
One of the things that strikes me about all of this is when you look at the map of the 7 or more different military organizations that have the country divided up. I mean, this is tough, and how you get any kind of unanimity between groups that are in power in particular places to give up that power seems to me to be a real heavy lift. Your thoughts?
First of all, Sudan is an incredible country. It's a country of incredible diversity. It's 50 million people. So we have a country that is of enormous size. It's of great strategic importance in terms of its mouth to the Sahel and port access. And so there are many sub-narratives to get into. But I think the most important thing, and something we've really tried to emphasize in the last few months since I began, is that on the issues related to the peace process, the Sudanese people are incredibly united, and we need to reinforce and amplify that unity. Now, on political questions, just like in our own country, you don't expect unity. That's an area where you can have a fight of ideas. But on the core questions for the talks, which is the need to end the war, ensure full access, not wanting the war to be a backdoor to power for former corrupt regime officials or Islamist extremists. They want to return to that civilian authority, and they do want a unified professional army under that civilian authority going forward. And these are all core elements that have been discussed before in Sudan and remain, I think, consensus positions, at least across the people. On the questions of long-standing questions, of the center versus the peripheries, of the identity, some of Sudanese political identity. These are very important questions that should play out in the years ahead, but they should play out in the context of that civilian process, not in the context of the negotiations. And so on the core questions for ending the war, I think the Sudanese people are deeply united, and we need to focus on that to end the war, and then work with them on a process where they can continue over many years to discuss and debate those other questions.
Your description is hopeful, but again, I come back to what bothers me is you talk about the Sudanese people wanting what you've described as an ideal situation. My problem is when you got organizations like this, the problem usually lies with the leadership that are in power in various parts of the country and them not wanting to give up that power. How would you address that? How would you describe that as far as the fragmentation of the various groups in the country?
I feel like the Sudanese people have been clear with all of us that they do not feel like the future of Sudan should be decided by the heads of two fighting forces that have horrifically abused the Sudanese people. We are open to a variety of paths forward, but this is not something where the Sudanese people are looking for power sharing between two negative actors. Now, we do see a future for the SAF, the army. It is an official institution of the state, has a proud history as well as some not so proud moments. That is not the same as what we see as an RSF or Janjaweed-based organization. So there is.
What about the rapid support forces? Same. Would you feel the same way about them?
We do not. We do not in terms of their history or their future. We believe that along with the other signatories to earlier peace deals, there needs to be a full integration into one integrated professional army, and that integrated professional army needs to be accountable to a civilian and eventually elected
That's
government.
going to be a heavy lift, given the size and the amount of ground that they control right now, to fold them into something that they don't really want. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Coons and recognize Senator Menendez for questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perriello, along with my colleagues, I want to reiterate our support for the recent letter to the administration calling for an immediate investigation and recognition of the RSF and its leader, General Dagalo, and their foreign enablers as gross violators of human rights pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. The RSF and the SAF have to comply with their obligations under humanitarian and human rights law, be held accountable for their war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. So I look forward to the administration's swift investigation and finalized report into this urgent matter. But based on the requests of our letter to the administration, can you share with the committee the interagency framework on this investigation? Can you share the status of the investigation and the sanctioning of affiliated high-level perpetrators?
Thank you, Senator. We have received the letter. We take it very seriously. As you know, we have been the lead in terms of sanctioning not just individual actors for atrocities committed on both sides, but entities, including banks, that have been enabling to those atrocities. We continue to communicate on an almost daily basis about the potential consequences based on ongoing actions, including actions currently related to El Fasher, in terms of the potential for us to expand those sanctions both internally and externally to those who are directly.
So when do you think the committee will get a response?
I do not know, but we will try to get you a response in a timely fashion. We know it's very serious.
I have had a long experience with the State Department. Timely fashion could be indefinite. So we'd like to have a greater sense of it so that we could understand what we should be pressing. According to unofficial reports, the committee has evidence to be concerned of potential illegal arms sales through neighboring countries, which reportedly being reported at IDP camps at Sudan's borders. Given the confirmed illicit activities of the Wagner Group in Sudan, as a special envoy, do you have the wherewithal to investigate and confirm the legitimacy of allegations, for example, of the UAE or even Chinese arms pouring into the country?
We were supportive of the UN expert panel, and I found these reports credible. We are continuing to look into this in terms of our own production of potential sanction packages, as well as communication with regional actors in our efforts to try to compel people to get to the peace talks. We are both focused on raising the cost of continuing the war, as well as trying to show the benefits to restabilizing Sudan going forward. And we take seriously and are supportive of efforts from this body, from the UN, and from the administration to continue to have a full record of what's happening and ensure consequences for those actions.
So you believe their reports are well-founded?
We believe that those are credible reports. There's been a significant open source reporting on ongoing activities, and we see the reality on the ground, which is clearly the fighting.
Based on your current work with regional leaders in restoring peace talks, in your opinion, how does the United States and its allies leverage targeted sanctions and humanitarian relief to initiate a ceasefire agreement? And if that's off the table, then what are our next steps with regional leaders and allies to move this conflict to a different phase? Our
message right now is the peace talks not only need to start, but they must succeed. Our Saudi hosts have also echoed the message that this should be the last round of talks because we need to end the war before it gets to a point of no return. I want to say that is going to take some work between now and the talks to continue to raise the political heat on actors for the cost of continuing the war, and that's what we're trying to do every day with every engagement, is build that political will that can compel a peaceful outcome.
If you had the ability to get something that you presently don't have in order to achieve the success you want, what would it be?
I think this goes back to Senator Rish's comment earlier. I think we need the world's attention on this. We need people to understand that the world is watching and that the world will hold accountable those that are committing the abuses and those that are enabling it. Right now we are building that attention, but it is, again, something that could go up several notches. Finally,
in April of last year, I called on the administration as it relates to sanctions on the Sudanese junta. President Biden issued Executive Order 14098 that expanded the U.S. ability to sanction individuals or groups that threaten security and peace and undermine the goal of democratic transition in Sudan. And although we've made progress on holding a select RSF militants and their security and arms supplier firms accountable, can we expect further sanctioning of high-ranking RSF and SAF leaders soon?
We are certainly prepared to do so. I think we are looking at that in the context of the current deterring of offensives on al-Fashir and the current dynamics of the peace talks. But both sides, and particularly RSF leadership, understand that possibility is imminent in terms of the tools that we have.
Well, it seems to me that as you get others to exert influence, we hope, to be constructive, there also has to be a continuing raising of the costs for those who are engaged in the conflict in meaningful ways. Thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. I'll defer my questioning and turn to Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator Coons, and Mr. Perriello. Good to see you. It was an honor to serve, serve with you in the House, and thank you for your leadership on this effort. Back in May of 2021, so about 3 years ago, I joined Senator Coons on a trip to Sudan at what you described as a moment of hope. It was a point after the People's Revolution, and I believe that we, the United States and others, should have been more forceful in terms of trying to isolate Hamedi and the RSF back then. They were clearly a rogue operation, and I think more could and should have been done. We are where we are now. So let me just pick up really on some of Senator Menendez's questions, and I think you telegraphed it a little, and I second the call to impose Magnitsky Act sanctions on the RSF and Hamedi in particular. As you said in your testimony, we've got a very dire situation in al-Fashir right now. That risks an already catastrophic situation in Sudan and likely to lead to atrocities against civilians in Darfur. So what tools are you, the United States, what is the Biden administration doing now, and what other countries are we working with to try to prevent, to deter the RSF from attacking al-Fashir?
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen, and thanks for all of your leadership over the years on foreign policy and dynamics with the State Department. We have been very clear with RSF leadership that there will be direct and immediate consequences of an offensive on al-Fashir. We have raised this through US-UN at the UN level and elsewhere to try to ensure that more actors are making clear the consequences of this. It is a situation that would be devastating for the reasons that Chairman Cardin and others have noted. It is a last civilian holdout. It's not, I don't say safe haven because I don't think any of us would consider it safe to be living in al-Fashir right now, but relative to the alternatives. We also see this having been an offensive by the RSF that has made the war more ethnic and polarized in nature, brought in some of the tribal militias that had been neutral in the war, and that is something that also makes it harder moving forward. But we've also communicated, in addition to the clear legal and moral violations here, that this is a strategic error, and we will continue to do the pressure. But we've been clear about consequences to the RSF leadership in the context of al-Fasher before. We have done so again in this case, and we will work with our multilateral partners. I just got back from Addis Ababa, meeting with both the African Union and the high-level panel, and I think there is a strong sense from our African counterparts and multilateral counterparts that this needs to be the world speaking with one voice about the consequences of moving on al-Fasher, and that means any of those that are have leverage with the RSF or have been supportive of the RSF need to be strong voices as well in saying that this is not a move that is acceptable under any circumstances. We do continue to see huge fragility and clashes in other parts of the country, and we want to make sure, in addition to the focus on al-Fasher, that we continue to see and work on everything from deterring atrocities to getting humanitarian aid in what is a vast, vast country as well.
Well, let me, you mentioned the role of the outside actors, right? The negative role many are playing. If you could talk specifically with respect to RSF about what we are saying and doing with the UAE, I would be interested in exactly what kind of pressure we're exerting there. And on the humanitarian front, you describe in graphic detail the terrible situation there. What are we doing to convince the SAF and other authorities in their area to reauthorize the critical aid corridor from Chad into Sudan?
So in the first, both the State Department and the White House at the highest levels have been communicating with all of our partners in the region the need to pull back from anything that is pouring fuel on this fire. But more than that's expected. We want proactive engagement and political muscle to push to a peaceful solution, and that nothing less than that is going to be acceptable as we go forward. We have gotten commitment from other actors, including the UAE, to participate in the new round of peace talks. We think that's important, along with the addition of Egyptians, the African Union, and others. We are seeing a larger number of actors engage in calls to those who've been supporting. Unfortunately, we're seeing a larger number of external actors play into this conflict. Some of those reports and actions, I think, have reminded some of our partners why pursuing this war may be disadvantageous for everyone involved and resolving it more quickly rather than seeing the kind of failed state that, as you know, many years ago was the land where Osama bin Laden built up al-Qaeda and planned attacks on U.S. soil. Seeing a failed state in a country of this size and strategic importance is in no one's interest. And so I think in addition to communicating the importance of consequences in this case, it's also being very clear that everybody loses if this war is pursued in the way it's been pursued, and everybody can stand to benefit from a stabilized Sudan back in the hands of the Sudanese people. On the aid corridors, we've had minor victories here and there of getting food through, but we are appalled at the systemic violations of international humanitarian law by the armed forces that wants to be treated and held to a higher standard, which they should be as a legitimate military institution. But if your response to that is to be enabling the starvation of the Sudanese people through everything from outright blocking of aid to ways of disrupting that flow, certainly the RSF needs to answer for a lot of the fragility that came from burning the harvests and burning the storehouses of food, harassing and attacking humanitarian workers, which SAF has done as well. We are in one of the toughest humanitarian situations in terms of delivery in the war. In the world, and as I mentioned before, it's about to get worse. The rainy season in Sudan brings a spread of disease. It's not a country that has a lot of hard tarmac roads, so we've been clear with SAF that the expectation is full access, both from Adre and Port Sudan, with unlimited access for aid workers across these hard tarmac roads. And so far, we have not seen that response. I will say it is very helpful that you all have passed the supplemental funding, because I think the sooner we have that aid present and forward deployed, then I think it's easier to find ways, more ways to get it inside. So I think the international community's had to do its part. And I think that was one of the shocking things that, that Senator Booker and I saw in the camps was even in Chad, where we have full access to the camps, you were down to about one meal a day. They were rationing because they didn't have enough resources. So we need to attack this problem from multiple angles. We need to make sure there's enough food and medicine there and that it's forward deployed to at least get to the people outside, and some of that can make its way inside, and continue to put full pressure on both sides to ensure the kind of humanitarian access. And I will say at the African Union 2 days ago, one of the leaders made a very powerful argument that we all know well of why international humanitarian law works. People have been having wars for centuries. They've been having wars for millennia. It is not true that you cannot deliver aid in war. In fact, there's a reason that we have the laws of war and that we have these humanitarian law. It is absolutely a baseline standard that starving people should not be part of how you conduct a war. And we continue to express the fact that there will be consequences for those violations. So some progress, particularly in, I think, our ability to increase aid on the outside, but also needing to get a major breakthrough on access internally.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Thank you for joining me on that trip back in 2021 when there was so much hope. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Special Envoy Perriello, there's hope that your appointment to this position will spark the need to end this latest chapter in a decades-long history of violence and humanitarian devastation in Sudan. I share that hope as well, but you're certainly aware that bringing a lasting peace to Sudan isn't achievable in your tenure, however long that will last. In that vein, I'd welcome your big picture perspective on what's achievable in a special envoy role beyond the obvious cessation of hostilities. Specifically, I'd welcome your reflections from your other special envoy role in the Great Lakes region and DRC, dealing with a lengthy, even intractable conflict. What victories and lessons learned do you take from Congo that you can apply in Sudan?
Thank you very much for the question and for the interest. It is true that we have been on a mad sprint the last 3 months. I hope the bags under my eyes can be testimony to how seriously we're taking the urgency of the talks. But we have had conversations and planning sessions about what is the mid-horizon and what is the far horizon. And how do we ensure that across our government, and I think this includes across branches of government, we are prepared to make sure that we are not only ready for failure, i.e. if this gets worse, what do we need to be thinking about by summer in terms of peacekeeping forces or other questions if we're at a fully factionalized war and famine, but also are we prepared for success? Are we prepared that if we can get a breakthrough on peace, that we know how difficult governing is? All of us know it. And that is something I think the Sudanese people want to take on as a project, and they want a very inclusive process there. But until the war is over, it's very difficult to get to some of those questions. To me, this is also part of the solution and the strategy, which is I actually think that the negotiated settlement should be relatively narrow. It should not renegotiate things the Sudanese people have already stated are important to them about an inclusive civilian government, about integrating a reformed professional military underneath that government. Those have been things that have been negotiated before, but we need to be ready for how do we build those democratic institutions, how do we build out the kind of civil society, particularly with youth that make up the vast majority of the country, and would look forward to the conversations about how we ensure being ready for that opportunity.
The role of foreign actors has been discussed already in terms of both those who have destabilized the situation and those who are seeking to bring stability to it. It would be challenging for anyone to defend the actions of those funding this fighting and the genocidal activity on the basis of legitimate economic activities. I'd like for you to clarify for the public unclassified record which countries are working as stabilizer and which are working as destabilizers in Sudan at this moment.
So I realize I didn't answer your Congo part of the question, but let me answer this so it doesn't look like I'm dodging that and can come up to the Congo
Sure.
question or whichever preference of sequence.
Yeah, go ahead. You
Okay.
can synthesize them if you like, but please do get to the question about stabilizers and destabilizers.
So in terms of lessons from the Democratic Republic of Congo, I'll tell you a negative lesson and a positive lesson. I have said that this conflict is starting to look too much like the DRC in the 90s in the sense that you have many ethnic populations inside Sudan that also overlap with populations in neighboring countries. And it's quite easy as this conflict becomes more ethnic and polarized in nature that it's harder and harder for neighboring countries not to be pulled in either directly into the fighting or facing destabilizing elements in their own country. So I think one lesson is that we need to end this before we get to a point where we are into not a two-sided war, but something that could become a 7, 8, 9-sided war. And related to that, I think it's going to be very important that we have a medium-term future for those who are currently fighting. For some, that will be an integration into the professional military. For others, we know that if we can find the kind of economic opportunities that make people feel invested in a future Sudan, a stronger, more democratic Sudan, that is going to be a much more promising path forward than if people feel like they primarily want to continue to identify with their armed affiliations, as we've seen in the DRC. In this case, I think we've seen many of the countries across Africa, from Kenya up to Egypt, be very constructive in reinforcing the importance of ending the war. Those that share a border with the country, I think, have been able to communicate, not just to each other, but to Gulf actors and others, that this war could consume everybody. So in addition, again, to the kind of humanitarian and human rights arguments we've made about the need to stop this war, I think there's been a very strong realpolitik, pro-stability argument that has come from many of the actors. Yeah. I think we're seeing the African Union and IGAD play a very constructive role in trying to ensure that there is the proper multilateral and African leadership on calling for that. We appreciate that the Saudis have agreed to host talks, and not just host talks, but have a more inclusive set of co-facilitators that we think collectively has enough leverage to compel the two sides to act. And we are hoping that we lock in the further details for those talks as we go forward. As I said, we've seen some actions from the United Nations that are positive in terms of the Ramadan ceasefire resolution, even though it was not respected, was at least a step toward showing that the UN is taking this more seriously, as was the expert panel. We certainly have felt like a number of countries in the region have been pouring fuel on the fire at key areas. Certainly there's been documentation in terms of the UAE's role, but also the question about Iran and open source reporting in other areas. And we think that it's very important that people understand this not as an opportunity to try to drive wedges and fissures, but to try to be part of a peace process.
You mentioned the UAE. What's motivating their interest in this situation?
Well, we can take that up, but I think what I'll say is what should be motivating them is that destabilizing Sudan will be something that has very negative repercussions for the region, and even for how their interests in the region, including what we've seen as an increase in some of the Islamist extremist elements that like to take advantage of a fractured or failing state. And we think it's important to understand that there will be growing consequences for the atrocities of the RSF and those who have been connected to them. In terms of their motivations more broadly, we can talk about that or our opinions of that going forward, but I think what's clear is they have committed to the peace talks. Yeah. They have committed to negotiating in good faith, and we believe that we can get to a point where we can be partners in a peaceful resolution in Sudan.
You don't want to offer an assessment of their motivation today?
I would say beyond the fact that we understand that everyone in the region has interests in the stability of the port and the economic development of the country. I think people probably have different versions of how that motivates them. But I think that what's clear is none of those things are well served by a protracted war. And therefore, we need to make sure, and I think this is getting through to a number of key actors, that everybody can benefit from a stable Sudan and nobody gains other than the extremists from it falling apart.
Thank you very much for your work and to members of your team. Mr. Perriello.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Kane.
Rep. Perriello, it's really good to see you. Very good to see you. Along with others on this committee, I began advocating for the creation of the special envoy position quite a while ago, because the magnitude of this challenge, including the fact that the world isn't paying sufficient attention to it, demonstrated that we really needed to up our game and devote more resources to being a part of the solution. I was so happy when finally the administration decided to create this position, and the fact that you, a longtime friend with deep background in the region and an expertise to be able to do this work with distinction, were nominated for it and put into the role is something I'm very gratified by. And I know I speak for many of my colleagues, and certainly Senator Warner, who also advocated for the creation of this position. I've got a couple of questions for you. The questions my colleagues have asked, I think, have done a good job of framing out the challenge. I want to make sure you have the resources to do the job that you need to do. But before I get there, just an observation. As you know, Virginia has a pretty significant diaspora community from Sudan. And we have a diaspora community from a number of African nations, because 1 out of 8 of us now is born in another country. One of the things I've noticed in the past in interacting with diaspora communities, and I'll use Ethiopia as an example, our diaspora here have different points of view. Some are sympathetic to the central government, some are more sympathetic to the Tigray region's leaders. So it's not uncommon within a diaspora community to find divided opinions. Within the Sudanese diaspora in Virginia, I've not found divided opinions. I've found among the Sudanese, as you point out, there was a belief that they had negotiated a path forward and that they believe both the ASF and the RSF are hijacking that path. And it's interesting to walk into a meeting of a diaspora community and not have an internal tension about who they support. They would very much support a process as you describe, and it's a very difficult thing, but it's nice to know that at least here at the home front, the diaspora community here with deep ties in Sudan are really on board with the vision that you and the administration have outlined. It's said here in D.C. that personnel make policy, and we pressed hard for this envoy position. Glad to learn, as I said, that you were Secretary Blinken's candidate, and I think you're the right one. Do you have what you need, both in terms of personnel and resources, to fulfill this very challenging mandate? And could you describe the makeup of the team that you're working with?
Thanks, Senator. And I do feel like I have had tremendous support from the State Department and the interagency all the way up to the Secretary. And I want to come back to that. But on your diaspora point, I think it's really important to underline what you've said. Because I think we see the same thing with Sudanese civilians across the region, many of whom are spread across Nairobi, Kampala, Chad, et cetera. This won't surprise any of you, but if you just look at Twitter and Facebook, you would think that people are very divided on certain political questions. But in fact, when you actually talk to people, and the polls show this as well, there is incredible consensus among the Sudanese people about wanting an end to the war and wanting a restoration of the arc that they had finally had that was hopeful. And I think even on some of the additional questions about things like not wanting to see the backdoor to power from former corrupt officials or Islamic extremists, again, they're very interesting and important questions that will take years for the Sudanese to decide and to debate, much like we have many in our own country. And that's the right thing to happen in a democracy that they hope to have. So there are questions that are quite vibrant discussions, but there's not disagreement on this core question about ending the war, returning to a civilian transition, and having an integrated professional military under SAF, bringing in not just the RSF, but the various JPA signatories into that process. They want to be proud of their military like we are, and they want the reforms and things that will get there. Some of those things will take years to happen, just like it took years to set up the Joint Command here. But again, I think we've seen that in the diaspora, and I want to give a particular acknowledgement, which again won't surprise you from your work, that this consensus has been particularly strong and particularly powerful among Sudanese women. We've seen this through various alliances around the region and inside. It's been such an important part of the resistance committees that helped bring Bashir down and that have helped to shield communities from harm during these atrocious circumstances. I've seen it in my organizing meetings around the region. Not only the group that is most likely to show up on time with an agenda and action steps ready is definitely going to be the alliances. We had a wonderful event here with Vital Voices that Linda Thomas Greenfield joined that had a number of very powerful Sudanese women speaking out on this experience. And of course, this is in no small part because women and girls have borne the brunt of many of the atrocities, certainly the horrific and systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, but also the issues of famine and starvation and displacement. So we do believe the diaspora in this case has a very important and constructive role to play. It also goes back to Senator Young's point and others about needing that to be a community that wants to return to Sudan, whether full-time or being investing there, whether that's investing their human capital or their other capital. And I think people do stand ready to build that future Sudan in this case. So I'm proud of how many we have in Virginia of people from Sudan, but also it is something where we've got a broader voice here that needs to be amplified and that we can try to center in these conversations. And I think that's an important message I've had to both our Saudi hosts and others about the talks, which is the baseline for the negotiations need to be what the Sudanese people have already stated as the framework.
I want the chairman to be able to ask questions. Can you just give me a very quick answer on, do you have the resources you need to fulfill your mandate?
We do. I mean, we have, posts have been incredible. As you know, I'm traveling almost every day, and that's a lot of work for an underfunded department. People have been wonderful. I think that there's some mid to over-the-horizon questions we can talk about, whether it's Special Envoy's office or Sudan more generally, of what we should be ready for in a case of further deterioration or a breakthrough. But I've been very appreciative of the welcome at State and the Secretary's willingness to engage directly on this issue at the highest levels with some of the key actors.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for those good questions and for your engagement and support on the creation of the Special Envoy. Special Envoy, let's talk through what we hope doesn't happen. Several members have raised the pending crisis in El Fasher. Just talk about what sort of planning is being done in the event there really is a full-scale assault by the RSF and a humanitarian crisis that's even worse than now in terms of protecting civilians. What planning's happening? What do you think you would most need from us? What could we do?
Senator, I sadly don't think I have a great answer to that question. We have obviously are very focused on preventing it from happening and looking at all deterrence power that we have to prevent that from happening. I think that the indications are that the various aid groups from WFP, UNICEF, et cetera, are trying to be prepared for what an influx would look like in Chad. Of course, there's a presidential election going on there, and there's some spillover effects, not just humanitarian-wise, but in terms of some of the ethnic flows. But we have not, I think, one of the biggest differences in my experience in Darfur 20 years ago or so and now is, there was much more discussion of civilian protection mechanisms at that point, of peacekeeping forces, whether AU or UN. We don't currently have things in a position that I think would be able to stand up rapidly in that context. I know US-UN has been raising these questions actively with the UN. I've raised this with the African Union in terms of possibilities, and we will, I think, be actually doing some conversations on that later today. But I think it's a very fair question to ask. It's a good reason to make sure it doesn't happen, that we have the fall, but continuing to look at how we can prepare better for that scenario.
What are we doing to document atrocities, to not just try and prevent human rights violations, but to document the atrocities that are being committed and to begin to deliver accountability? There was discussions earlier about imposing sanctions on specific individuals. In the absence of any effective and real accountability mechanism, the deterrence for military leaders across the country from a range of backgrounds to stop blocking humanitarian access and to stop carrying out atrocities. There's not much of a deterrent effect. I'd be interested in what you think we're doing and what other actors can or should be doing to strengthen the deterrence of ongoing atrocities?
So I think the United States deserves a great deal of credit, thanks to the budget you all have approved, for supporting over 100 different civil society organizations. It's probably underguessing the number that have been doing everything from emergency relief to deterrence and accountability, including documentation. As you can imagine, we were required to have quite a bit of evidence to move forward with OFAC sanctions in the way that we've done. We've also seen groups like Raoul Wallenberg and others document abuses and draw from both international NGO and Sudanese efforts, often produced with great courage. I think there is an effort to ensure, as in past cases, that we can document as much as we can. We also know that because of the telecom blackouts and because of just rampant harassment, abuse, and detention of civil society actors, that we have not always gotten a complete record. One of the things that, to me, captures just how invisible and horrific this war is that we don't have a credible death count. We literally don't know how many people have died, possibly to a factor of 10 or 15. The number was mentioned earlier, 15 to 30,000. Some think it's at 150,000. We are now supporting a couple of efforts to use methodologies to document and get to that, so we at least know what kind of consequences we're looking at here. Some of that has been, again, people operating under extremely difficult situations, and that's why I think it's important that the United States, probably more than any other country, has been supporting civil society efforts in a variety of ways. That includes aid delivery, but it also includes issues of local reconciliation efforts that are ongoing. I mean, one of the things that we know is likely if we are to get a breakthrough on peace is people returning to homes that are destroyed and possibly knowing the person that destroyed it living in the same community. And I think these civil society groups have shown tremendous creativity in Sudan over the past few years and how we think about those kinds of reconciliation efforts in addition to accountability. But we will continue to support efforts to collect that documentation.
Senator Van Hollen referenced the trip that he and I took to the UAE, to Kenya, and to Sudan, to Khartoum back in 2021. It was a very hopeful time. There was steady progress. I've done my best to support Sudan's peaceful revolution and most importantly, the grassroots pro-democracy organizations, the resistance committees, the women's organizations that you've referenced. Some actors have criticized the negotiation process as really just focusing on two military leaders and two militaries and not emphasizing the importance of returning to the pathway towards democracy and the civilian-led pathway towards democracy that was so hard-fought and hard-won. You seem clear on this. What more could we be doing? You can tell there's an interested and engaged Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We've had active participation here on a bipartisan basis from a majority of the committee members. What more could we be doing to support and strengthen your ability and the ability of the United States to engage with actors beyond just these two military leaders to try and ensure that we get back to that path towards civilian-led democracy in Sudan?
Thank you, Senator. I think that any effort to show that this committee is hearing from and centering the voices of the Sudanese people in the way that you've done in your statements and in your speeches, showing that unity of the Sudanese people, not allowing bad actors to claim disingenuously divisions. Again, not that there aren't political divisions, but that those are not divisions about the core questions about the future of Sudan is important. I think we would like to see more countries join us in the sanctions effort and other punitive measures for bad actors, and that includes our multilateral partners as well. I think that interest is growing. One of my reasons for hope is that in addition to the advocacy you all have done to elevate this in the administration, we've seen the appointment of a UN envoy. We've seen the High Panel on Sudan become more active, and I, again, met with the three of them yesterday-ish. And it's an incredibly serious and powerful group of people who have a lot of experience, I think, that can be brought to bear here. So we'll continue to try to build that. But I think this just goes back to something I want to emphasize in terms of what the strategy is, which is we really do have two generals who could end the war tomorrow if they had the courage. They don't. And so the issue is pretty simple. How do we create enough political and diplomatic pressure to compel a deal? And I think that is where we can continue to work together on what raises the cost of pursuing that war on the one hand, and how do we ensure what that peace looks like. And again, because of the reasons you've said, I think the goal is sequencing this in a way that says we don't need to solve every part of Sudan's problems and challenges. That's up to the Sudanese people to do. And rushing those things into these negotiations doesn't do a service to them or to those questions. We need to reach the limited number of questions that are necessary to end the war and restart that civilian transition. Again, that wasn't perfect the first time, but learning the lessons from the last time.
But if I may, weapons and ammunition continue to flow into Sudan. This is a country of 50 million people. Somehow, from a variety of ways, by air, over land, the means of fighting and continuing fighting keep flowing in. They're not being manufactured in Sudan. They're being supplied by outside actors. Humanitarian relief needs to flow into Sudan at a much higher level. By my count, we spent $920 million in fiscal year 23 in supporting Sudanese refugees outside of Sudan and in trying to provide humanitarian relief inside Sudan. We're going to need to provide much more than that this year. I am so relieved and grateful that the $9 billion in humanitarian aid was a part of the package that ultimately passed the House and the Senate. But if we can't deliver accountability to outside actors and to inside actors that are both flowing weapons in and not delivering humanitarian aid, we're not going to be able to bring an end to this. What's the most important targeted thing we could be doing to raise the costs of blocking humanitarian aid delivery and of continuing to provide arms in violation of the UN arms embargo?
Let me actually say a quick word on the aid side, and then I'll go to the arms embargo question, which is, as you know, that money was not earmarked because of the nature of how it went through, or not for Sudan. I think it is very helpful for the implementing partners to understand how much Sudan is a priority and that speed is of the essence. We have had good pledges from our partners in Paris. We'd really been carrying the bulk of the burden ourselves. And even within our own system, it's one thing to pledge that money. It's another to be seeing food and medicine arrive, in addition to the access and blockage issues. So I think reinforcing both that we expect that to translate into real results on the ground and to do so quickly is very important. The arms embargo, I want to go back to something Senator Risch said, which is, I think he was quoting either the UN expert panel or SG, that it's illegal, it's immoral, and it must stop. That is existing law and mandate under the existing arms embargo. It is certainly something where we are communicating the consequences of violating that. This is something we've talked to the African Union and the high-level panel on. This is, again, something that affects many of their member states in this conversation. And we've seen some very strong statements from a number of the African leaders about the importance of enforcing this embargo and ensuring consequences for that. So we do think that that is something that is very important. And as I said in my earlier statement, there is no one who can claim ignorance here about what the RSF's modus operandi is, what it's been historically and what it is right now. That is well documented in the public realm in terms of what you are doing if you are sending arms to that particular group. And with SAF, I think the key message right now is about humanitarian access and need to respect international humanitarian law.
I introduced the Sudan Democracy Act in 2021 just to highlight the urgency of holding military leaders accountable for impeding the transition to democracy. I'm working to reintroduce a similar piece of legislation in this Congress, and I'm hopeful that it's complementary to your efforts. What would you most need or expect in legislation that strengthens the urgency of imposing accountability?
So I think that the Congress across both parties and both houses has been extremely clear about their desire for consequences for those that are committing atrocities and those that are enabling it. and I think that message has been heard in the region and will continue to be heard. I think the Sudanese people have felt in many times in this war rendered invisible. So even ensuring the funding for civil society, the funding for humanitarian aid, having a hearing like this, perhaps a subsequent one with Sudanese diaspora and civil society members, all can do that. But the key here is to show, I think, the most important thing, and I understand why some people doubt this, which is we don't have the luxury of not having hope, of not believing this problem can be solved. When we say that it can't be solved, it's enabling those that are continuing it. This thing could be solved tomorrow if the political will were there of the key actors inside and outside. And we must be clear that we do not accept the idea of this war continuing, and we are going to build the political will across the region to compel it to be over, and that the Senate stands in partnership with ensuring that through both raising the costs and being prepared to commit to a peaceful and democratic Sudan that will take years of partnership to build.
Thank you. That's very well put. A nation of 50 million, where there are millions and millions of internally displaced people and refugees, 5 million on the very door of famine, and where it resembles the worst conflicts I've seen in my time in public service, the DRC, Libya, Yemen, the pernicious impact of outside actors, the failure of attention by the international community, the absolutely critical role the United States is playing, and the need for regional actors to engage and engage forcefully. I look forward to working with you on this, Special Envoy. I appreciate your leadership. I'm going to invite Senator Booker to now join this hearing and out of the experience he recently had with you in traveling to the camps in Chad. Senator Booker?
Thank you, Senator Coons. I appreciate your grace in this moment, as always. And you'll have to forgive this ongoing conference call, which you heard me on right now, that a lot of members are engaged in, that was competing with this time. But I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to sit with you again. We weren't quite dressed the same last time we were together. But I just want to say for the record how extraordinary I found my time with you, not just because of your knowledge, your thoughtfulness, your sort of larger understanding of pragmatic strategy, but honestly, to have a person in the position that you are in to see so clearly your heart and your empathy and your hurt about what was going on, the authenticity of your spirit encouraged me more than you know, and I'm grateful. You are where you are, you're doing what you're doing, and I just want to give my gratitude to your team, because dealing with this every day, I found myself when I left there so overwhelmed by the enormity of the crisis, the agony of it all, that it was difficult to go on with my work without being really permanently affected. So I can only imagine how you're having to deal with this in every moment of every day as you and your team try to find a way to resolve this conflict. I want to start my questioning with just this clear determination that the administration has already made, declaring ethnic cleansing, declaring war crimes, to talk to Masalit when I was there and hear their agonizing stories. It is clear that those declarations, in my opinion, were well-founded. But the question is sort of what is the follow-up, the administration after the declaration, to really try to prevent the isolation of certain ethnic groups and what clearly is an attempt to annihilate them.
Well, thank you for the question and the kind words. It's, as you know, the situation even in Chad, when people have escaped true terror-type conditions, is still pretty bleak. We are incredibly grateful that UNICEF and WFP and OCHA and others are there helping people, but you could see the trauma on people's faces. You could also feel the growing level of anger and polarization when you've seen your community, your people, ethnically cleansed, when you've seen your sisters and mothers raped, and with that being an intentional part of the war and a targeting of communities. And as I've heard over and over again, the re-traumatization of getting outside and realizing the world didn't even know what was going on. I remember being at an iftar of people who'd recently escaped Darfur on a different trip. This was, I think, in Kampala. And that was the just disbelief of people who had spent months in terror and darkness to come out and realize how little attention the world was paying to this. I think we're seeing that shift. I think we're seeing more coverage. We're certainly seeing an elevation of diplomatic efforts, and I think that's been noticed and felt. I think that the people that are fighting and fueling this war are feeling more heat, and therefore, I think, hopefully, more of a commitment to helping to resolve the conflict. So to your question about what the actions are, the number one thing we are trying to do is to end the war. And we are not trying to end that war by some power-sharing arrangement between bad actors. It's about restoring the constitutional transition that began years ago and handing the future of Sudan back to the Sudanese people. We have sanctioned not just individuals on both sides, but I think it's important to note banks and other institutions that have enabled those committing atrocities on both sides. We are prepared to expand the number of people and entities that are that would be sanctioned in the context of a number of ongoing issues, including the peace talks and the offensive in al-Fashir. We also are hoping to get other countries to join us in ensuring consequences. And I think here we've really appreciated our partnership with the African Union, with the high-level panel, with IGAD, in trying to ensure a stronger voice among our African counterparts in helping to resolve this war and helping to name and call out those who are committing atrocities against the Sudanese people. But that cost is going to have to go up for us to be effective.
And you speak of other countries joining in the economic sanctions. I'm really concerned with the arms embargo and the ease at which it seems to be arms are transiting into the conflict. And if you have any thoughts on how we could be doing a better job of enforcing that.
I can, but I will not be nearly as powerful as Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who has been very clear in her position at US-UN, not only about Sudan being one of our top 3 priorities. That was very clear in her New York Times piece. She's repeated it several times in Security Council settings. There should be no ambiguity about how much of a priority the situation in Sudan is. And she has certainly been raising this in a number of ways in terms of what the UN can do about it, from the Ramadan ceasefire to questions about the existing arms embargo. And it is very clearly something that is being violated in terms of arms coming in. So it's a good question to ask. I think we're seeing leadership not just from the administration, from the State Department, the Envoy's office, but a full intergovernmental interest in how we can ensure that embargo is respected. And we also know that there are many parts of Sudan that are fragile right now beyond Darfur. Darfur certainly is a place of some of the greatest fragility, particularly with the concerns about al-Fashir falling. And that is a place where there's already an existing arms embargo, even without expanding that to the country as a whole. But we also know that there are ethnic groups in other parts of Sudan that are under attack or facing threat of ethnically charged violence as well.
And can you, maybe for the record, the complexity of the various other nations that are choosing sides or have been linked at least allegedly to be supporting and fueling this conflict, it sort of belies a little bit of logic to have, allegations made that the Saudis are on one side with the Iranians, the Emiratis might be on the other side, that the Turks, Egyptians, that a lot of people are playing in this space. These are the allegations, at least. It creates a much more complicated picture that may be giving and fueling this sense of both Hemedti and Burhan, that they have wind at their back or hope that they could be victorious, otherwise being left as simply being an internal conflict. Is there anything you could say to help sort of like paint that picture on the record?
I think there are ways in which this conflict is actually extremely simple, and then there are ways in which it's incredibly complex. I think on the simple side, this was a war of choice that was started by two generals and their leadership corps having a power struggle over control of the country and the military. It was not something the Sudanese people wanted. I don't think it was something that was primarily fueled in terms of its instigation by outside actors. And this was preceded by, of course, those two actors that are now fighting, having colluded in a coup to prevent the people from having their civilian and democratic future. So as much as these two are fighting with each other, they also have a very long history of working together and interactions from the creation of the RSF itself through. In that sense, I think in the simplest way, I come back to the idea that this war was a war of choice, and it also could be that those same leaders choose to end the war tomorrow. They're not going to, but it should be clear in terms of the blame for this suffering. That the RSF and the SAF have decided to have this war, and they've decided to continue this war. In terms of the external actors, this can get very complex very quickly, and I think this is where part of what we have been crystal clear about in the last few months with all of the actors, those who are being constructive and those who are not, is whatever you felt about this situation a few months ago. We certainly think everyone should have been appalled by the level of atrocities and suffering. But even if that is not something that gets to your heart, at least on the level of your head, this is now getting out of control. And because we see more, not just foreign governments potentially being involved, but foreign actors, foreign fighters, and others, you take a two-sided war and start to make it much more complex, which makes it typically much harder to solve and resolve. The Sudan is, of course, a vast land geographically, and it is the place where bin Laden spent 5 years building out the al-Qaeda network and planning attacks on U.S. targets. And the only people who win from the country falling apart in the way that it could are extremists who want to do harm, not just to us, but to many of the regional actors. So I think at this point, the simplest way to think about the conflict is that everybody loses on the course we're on, and there's a lot of benefit to everybody from having a stable Sudan on a democratic path as a very diverse, inclusive democracy with a rich and robust civil society with, like much of Africa, the vast majority of the population being under the age of 35, with that creativity we've seen from the emergency response rooms and resistance committees. Like, let's unleash that positive innovation of a generation that could build a very, very different Sudan going forward versus a situation in which we spend 10 or 15 years dealing with the fallout from this war of choice.
The state of the bringing these diverse countries, these invested countries together. I know there are some extraordinary leaders in the Arab nations who have, like the United States, a great deal of capacity to perhaps end this if there was coordinated, focused collective will. And I'm wondering if you could just give me sort of an understanding of where things stand in terms of the Jeddah talks resuming, or some way to bring everyone together, not having competing parallel tracks discussions which seem to further the divide and reinforce the gulf, but bringing everyone together in talks, be they the resumption of Jeddah or otherwise, to begin to truly end this.
So I do think it's been a significant diplomatic accomplishment to get the Jeddah talks back on track, but not just on track, but one, with a broader set of actors, the commitment to some key Gulf and African partners that I think are important for pulling this off. But also that we've actually seen a lot of alignment from key partners on endorsement of Jeddah to end the forum shopping. There's plenty of criticism out there about Jeddah in the past, and we can talk about the water that's under the bridge, but in Paris it was very clear in all of the statements coming out of that, including the EU colleagues, the African colleagues, et cetera, that there was an endorsement of the Jeddah process as the right one forward for the ending of the cessation of violence piece. Similarly, in Addis this week, with the expanded mechanism of the African Union, the high-level panel, again, an endorsement of the idea that we need to consolidate in the Jeddah process. Now, that's partly from drawing on lessons we've learned from other efforts. We want to draw from all of those things. And we don't want Jeddah to solve every question. We want it to end the war. Right. Again, we want to protect a significant number of questions for an inclusive political dialogue that the AU and others have such a key role in playing. So I think we are seeing both the consolidation around urgency to end the war, a need to endorse the Jeddah process. And as I've said to those who will not be part of the Jeddah process, you don't have to be in Jeddah to be part of Jeddah. We are not waiting until Jeddah to negotiate the end of this war. We're negotiating every day. Every meeting, every engagement, every policy move is about ending this war. And that is based on creating an aligned and elevated political will sufficient to compel that outcome. And there are many things countries can do, including our European allies and partners, like increasing the cost of the war from their perspective, that is contributing to the potential success of those negotiations. And I think that's where we need an all-hands-on-deck approach.
I have one last question and perhaps one point to make before we close. I went there thinking that we would talk a lot about food aid and the urgencies there, and I'm grateful that we got a supplemental done to get critical needed food resources that are still not enough. I'm grateful for the conference held recently in Europe, the donors conference, and substantive resources provided, but still I don't think enough if this conflict continues. But what shook me was the trauma, that it wasn't just the horrible rising levels of seeing children that were malnourished, the famine and its implications to stunting and more, but I've never left the conflict more affected by the urgent need for socio-emotional, psychological, trauma-informed care. And I don't know if you have any insights, maybe to put on the record in regards to that need, given as we saw the women and children that made up predominantly the folks in the camp, but the stories of horrific sexual violence, witnessing the deaths of children and spouses and parents, the rape and the abuse, the robberies, the sheer gravity and extent of it calls out for more than just the food aid that we often are, and medical aid we're talking about.
It's a great question, and there are lots of experts better positioned to talk about the kind of counseling and support that's needed. But to get to the essence of the question, I think this war has been dehumanizing. And the best response to that is to rehumanize. And there are many things I think we need to be doing now to try to rehumanize the Sudanese people, particularly women and youth who've borne the brunt of this. And being seen as part of that, being heard. Again, I think that's something where we can act now. I think there's also a particular recognition, and I've had these more complicated conversations with some of the Sudanese civil society leaders that, we always want them to be in the lead and their voices to be in the lead, and they should. On the other hand, I think they will say, we've been doing this for 12 months, shouting into the wind. We've been doing it for 10 years, 5 years. And I think there is a need for all of us to do our part, not to in any way replace their voices with ours, but we do need to be aggressively proactive about how we can amplify those voices, what we can do as allies to raise the concerns that are there. I do think the U.S. government has been very supportive of almost all the major civil society networks, including some that are providing this kind of care. It's interesting. I was at an NGO we support in Kenya that's sort of a support hub for some of the youth activity, Sudanese youth activity. And they got in a physical area, but they built into it, not as part of the original plan. One was a child care center, and another was a place to do trauma care. And that was something, even though they were going to be doing more sort of media campaigning hub support, it just became clear that you couldn't be bringing this group of actors together and not addressing some of these other needs. So I think, and that was something that I think it was either USAID or stated support. I think it was USAID. So I think we are doing a lot of that, but we have to do more. And finding the right way to help, as we talked about, tell this story, tell their story not for them, but understand that they have been not just suffering and so much trauma, but they have been trying to get the world to care about this. And I think that's, again, why this committee, including its staff, has been so essential in saying there is a group that has been paying attention this whole time, paying attention even before the war began. And I think that's one of the things. But on the practical matter, yes, we need to be thinking about out-year budgets. If you're an aid organization now, I mean, I'll let them decide. Like, I don't know what decisions they make, but I know if people are starving, then there's a good chance you're going to shift your budget to food over psychosocial counseling, and we should be in a position where they're not having to make that choice. But again, I think that the number one priority is to end the war, because each day it goes on, there are more atrocities committed to more individuals and more of that trauma. But I hope that you and your colleagues will continue to see this, again, not as a short-term engagement on Sudan. Whether or not the special envoy's role is a shorter or medium term, we can get into in other conversations. But the partnership with Sudan clearly is something that will need to go on for a long time. And hopefully we see not just a need to stand with Sudanese people, but to make a long-term investment, particularly in the younger generation, that we think can build a very different and better and more resilient Sudan.
I'm so happy you said that. And maybe the best way to bring this to close is to return to you and I in Adre. And I think what it's worth putting on the record is that Chad is one of the poorest nations on the planet. I think in the top 5 lowest income per capita nations on the planet. And yet you and I found in with the governor of Abrecha, if I'm pronouncing that right, and the prefect in Adre and the people of that community, this extraordinary wealth of spirit. You could see they were mobilizing their communities to welcome strangers into their community and deplete their minimal resources in efforts to try to meet the enormity of the pain and the agony. And so in this poor community, they demonstrated extraordinary wealth. And I believe that the poverty that has sustained this crisis is not with the people in Chad or the actual people of Sudan who have terrible material poverty, but it's the poverty with the rest of the world and the wealthy nations of the world. When we saw this crisis begin 6 months before Gaza and Israel's horrific October 7th beginning, there was still no action. And so the real poverty is a poverty of action. What we saw there, having aid workers, I'll never forget the French woman with tears in her eyes begging me that they had already cut rations. The poverty that's suffering, that the folks there are suffering, is a poverty of generosity. When you see press story after press story, headline after headline about so many other areas in the world, but a lacking of it for this crisis, given its degree, its enormity, the millions and millions of lives affected, you see a poverty of attention. And when you understand that we all have equal dignity and we all have equal humanity, that we are our brothers and our sisters' keepers, that the human family is intricately interwoven and intertwined. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here now in the global context for the people of Sudan is a poverty of empathy. Martin Luther King said it so compellingly decades ago, and it is so true now. What we will have to repent for in our day is not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. We are the good people, but we have to repent. And the pathway for our own redemption in this globally horrific crisis that has suffered our poverty of love, the only pathway for repentance that I can see is what you said. Yes, we need to end this fighting, but the crisis will not be over. We still saw the scars in Chad of the 2005 Darfur crisis, that they were still struggling with that a generation later. That the pathway for redemption has to be in sustaining the attention, the empathy, the focus on this crisis, even after the conflict has stopped. Because that is what's going to be needed to somehow heal from what has been, in my lifetime, one of the greatest humanitarian crises ever to come to fore. I thank you, my brother, for your heroic leadership. There are so many good people doing good things, showing a richness of spirit. But God bless us in the world of wealthy nations, and forgive us for our sin of poverty, that poverty of love. And I hope that with the attention that you're bringing to this crisis and others, that we will redeem ourselves. Thank you. And with that, I want to thank you for appearing for this crisis and inform you that, again, the record for the hearing will remain open until the close of business on Thursday, May 2nd. I will ask all senators to ensure that their questions are submitted no later than that date. With that, the chairman of the committee
You had the crescendo just right.
has returned to remove the power from the hands of the novice chairperson. I enjoyed it while it lasted. Out, brief candle. Mr. Chairman, I yield to you as always.
Senator Booker, when you are the president pro temp on the floor of the United States Senate, you have all the power of the gavel. And when I'm speaking, when you're presiding, it gives me a great deal of respect to know who's in control of the United States Senate at that time. So it was good to know that you were in control of this committee. You did a great job in control of holding the gavel. Thank you for your testimony. I'm just going to make a brief comment. Yes, we've got to get the peace process moving. That has to be the priority. And that's going to require the outside actors to not fuel the flames, but to work towards a real peace process that can bring the parties together. I was impressed by your comments that there's more unity in the country relating to an outcome for peace and negotiations than you see in the ethnic fighting that's taking place. That gives us some hope. But in the meantime, we have an immediate humanitarian crisis. We have a city that's at risk. 800,000 individuals are at risk. We have people starving, going to Chad to the borders, trying to seek food. So the immediate attention needs to be to deal with avoiding those atrocities and providing the humanitarian needs in the country. And that needs to be where we place our attention, as we also place our attention towards a process that can lead to a negotiated solution for the future of Sudan. So I very much appreciate your candor today. Believe me, we are very interested in implementing U.S. leadership to resolve a process for peace, but we also need your recommendations as to how we can deal with the current humanitarian crisis to avoid further atrocities and to provide the humanitarian assistance that is needed. As I said at the beginning of this hearing, I thank you very much for your willingness to take on this challenge. It's an incredibly difficult circumstance today because I believe not only the historic ethnic challenges of the country, but also the support, contrary to the UN Security Council resolutions, that the various factions are receiving from third-party countries, which I think needs to end. So with that, let me thank you again. The record will remain open until the close of business tomorrow. If members have questions, we would ask that you would answer those questions, and we would ask that you continue to keep us informed as to how your work is proceeding, where we can be helpful, and so that we're not surprised if we find certain developments occurring and keep us engaged. We appreciate that very much. With that, the hearing will stand adjourned.